Hey, dear friends, it's a joy and it's a privilege here this evening time. We decided to, do this book review on this classical book review called The Pilgrim's Progress. Now, my name is Richard Nadar, and I'm from Christian Alliance International School, and I teach Christian ethics. I teach AP Psychology as well as AP World History, and I have with me Dr. Jonathan Johnson, and Dr. Jonathan is actually, he did his bachelor's in arts degree, and he also did his master's in church history and history, and then most importantly he did his PhD in apologetics. I mean, specializing in apologetics. So it's a great joy to collaborate with each other and do this book study together. And the reason is why. The question is why. Why did we decide to have this book study? I think one of the important thing is that we live in 21st century, and we kind of forgetting how a universal life looks like. We kind of trying to understand what life is all about. So one of the best way to do that is go back to the classics. How did people in the past imagine life to be? And so it's one way, that's just one reason as to why we want to do this, is to have a broad scope of what that human life entails. And secondly, most importantly, is that we want to actually, here understand that broad life, which sometimes people often call it as the story in terms of the biblical perspective or the Christian perspective. So that's what we're going to look at, in this particular few series of Pilgrim's Progress. Why do you think these classics are important, or what are these classical literature all about?
Yeah, I like how you mentioned that with the importance of the classics, and it's great to be here with you. Thank you to Richard and to the school for allowing me to come and chat with you for a little while and spend some time with Richard. But when we talk about the classics, one of the things that's fantastic about them is that they give us not only a sense of the universal, what is important in lives around the world and through time, but also they're classics in a culture somewhere. So they may be classics in China, maybe classics in India, classics in Africa, in Europe and Britain. And so you're getting the best of both worlds, that you're finding out about our universal experience, what is true in everybody's life. But then you're also getting to see those universal truths kind of putting on the clothes of the culture and the time that they were in. And that's the fun of it, is that even though it's situated, as our novel's going to be, in England, hundreds of years since in the past, yet at the same time it speaks to us and it resonates in a way that is classical. It's going to endure forever because the story that it's talking about is something that we see in our lives and something that's going to resonate with us no matter where we come from and who we are. And for the extra credit of this is, the classics are also retained because they're great literature, they're great art. Right. And there's something that's uplifting and ennobling about studying the classics, and you're almost receiving a great kind of education. In fact, about the book we're going to talk about in just a few minutes, I heard someone say that if you could read this book, you were getting a biblical commentary, you're getting a work on theology, you're getting a great novel. And so when you read these things, they're not only touching so many nerves in our own life, they're really lifting us up as people. So it's a great education as well as a chance to be in touch with our humanity.
Yeah. Okay, so let's come back to the author of this novel, or I would say the fictional novel, John Bunyan. Now, who was John Bunyan? I think, let me just give you a date. We are talking about the time period of 1628 to 1688, his birth and his death. And we have quite a bit of information that he was actually a son of a tinker. Now you may wonder, who is a tinker? Okay, not somebody who works at Shamshepo, I mean, say, a tinker is someone who basically handles or worked or repaired with pots and pans and those kind of things. So that's where you get a background of John Bunyan. Apart from that, he had a very sinful lifestyle from what we heard, and his conversion, his transformation to becoming a Christian came much later when he was after his marriage to his first wife. And that's John Bunyan's brief background. Do you have any information,
Yeah.
Dr. Jonathan?
So yeah, it's kind of important, as you mentioned, Richard, him being a tinkerer, because if you look at his sinful life and you look at his family's occupation, there was no signs that he was going to be a great preacher or teacher of the Bible or even a writer. But it's an amazing story we're going to see that he writes. But also during his time was one of a lot of religious unrest, a lot of uncertainty. There was conflict even among people who believed really a lot of the same things. And so during this time, there was actually some religious wars, both in the main part of Europe and in England. And so he was going to be caught up during this time when the king and some of the religious leaders of the Anglican Church were really trying to consolidate and make people uniform. And around 1662, they passed this Act of Uniformity. And because of that, they basically said, either you do what we want you to do with preaching or teaching, or we're going to put you in jail, persecute you. At that time, you couldn't even come within 5 miles of a city. So if Richard or I were like John Bunyan, we could not come into a city where we might preach. And so this is what led to his imprisonment and what we today would say some religious persecution for his beliefs.
Yeah, correct. And like one of his particular religious background and that we have known from history is this, that he was mostly associated with the Puritanism or being a Puritan. Now, if you know anything about English history, being a Puritan was a highly honorable and sanctified life. That's what the Puritans are known for. They basically push the bar very high. And but there was also another group of people who were also called as the Separatists. Is there a difference between who are the Puritans and the Separatists?
Yeah, that's a great question, Richard, because there's a lot of overlap if you think about them. The Puritans, one easy way to think about it is they were really trying to purify the Church of England, trying to get it to go what they believed in a more biblical direction. But during this time of tension, some of the folks were really pushed out by the Anglican Church, and they became separate from and separatists. Others, by the way, of their own convictions, maybe a lot like Bunyan had said, no, I don't belong in this Church of England, the Anglican Church. And so the tricky thing is, there were some Puritans solely in the Anglican Church, whether that be high or low, and then there were some people purely separatist, but then there's a lot of people in the middle ground where it's hard for us to say, were they more of a separatist or more of a Puritan? And John Bunyan is such a likable, lovable, and amazing figure that both sides claim him. Separatists say he was definitely one of ours. Puritans say he's definitely one of ours, because what he achieved was so significant in God's service and then also in his writing, a classic.
Right. So the fellowship that he attended, it's called as what, Bedfordshire?
Yeah.
Bedfordshire. So that's a place that he basically fellowshiped together, and there's a mentor I heard, or a pastor who actually was instrumental in his conversion, is John Gifford, right?
Yes.
So now in the historical background, it does refer to John Gifford's influence on John Bunyan. But apart from that, there's also one more thing that's the background of John Bunyan, which is that during this whole civil war and the restrictions on preaching, I heard that he was sent to prison for 12 years. What's the effect of that imprisonment and John Bunyan's spiritual life?
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question to ask. I think maybe one thing we can assume as we read the book is that his persecutions and his difficulty, his imprisonment, maybe that's one of the things that really works into him, kind of a tenderness and being sympathetic to people who are in low places. You're going to see that a lot in the book. So that may be one thing. The other thing is it gave him a chance to write and to be active in this, because I think as people in ministry know, you get busy doing a lot of things, but God allowed him to enter into this difficult time and he had some chances to do this writing, and also we could say he was doing this writing in the service without the chance to have great rewards, right? He wasn't a superstar as he was writing it. So that allowed it to be very honest, very pure in that way, and it's not as if he was a bestseller writing another novel. This is a man who's suffering and writing it out of his heart's truth. So.
Right. The book that we are referring to is in my hand. This is one of the sample. Now, remember this. It's published in 1678, and it has undergone multiple gone through multiple publishers. So this is one of them. There is what is called Penguins. There is Classics, and so there are multiple publishers on this. And now one of the things that I'm really intrigued is the kind of language, you know. What kind of language do you think John Bunyan is using? So how can we read this?
Yeah, it's a great question, because the writing is definitely a novel. In fact, Richard and I were just talking about how it's one of the first English novels in history. So it's interesting for that reason. But the writing is very creative. It's almost like a fantasy, if you like fantasy, because it uses so much imagery and so many pictures and symbols. And we call this kind of writing an allegory. And so in this allegorical type of writing, Bunyan is going to use images and symbols, pictures and creatures and people. And many of these are going to represent ideas. They're going to represent really types of things in people's lives that they face in their journey of life. So it is an allegory, and we mentioned that at the beginning because that's really going to be important as you read it, to keep in mind that this is an allegory. And because of that, for some people, there's the danger or the tendency to just read it in any way or in any kind of direction. But for Bunyan, it's pretty tightly tied to biblical ideas and simple ideas within the story. So you'll figure it out as you're reading the book. And then also, too, there's a lot of good study guides and commentaries that we're going to share some links and resources with you to help you understand this allegorical style.
Right. What about, any other literature that we have that kind of use similar allegories?
Yeah. Well, actually, a lot of the classics are full of allegories. Over in China, some of the classics that they would use allegories to illustrate things, but then also some of you might be familiar with writings like the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. And of course, C.S. Lewis would often say he wasn't writing allegories, but the rest of the world says, yeah, he was. The things that he did, for instance, Aslan the lion is representing, we would say, God or a creator in these things. So there are many different ways, and even a lot of the great movies today and great popular works today, they'll still have symbols like items and objects and creatures or people that represent some idea. So it's really everywhere, no matter where you go. You can't get away from allegory.
Yeah. And what these allegories does is that it provides you a form of thinking. It provides you an image of what that idea means, so that you have a clear conception of where the story is moving towards. So allegories play a very important role.
Yeah. And I will add too as well, for the allegories, it also makes it memorable, right? It's something that you can remember. And for those of you who have read through the Bibles and the Gospels, a lot of the things and the ways that Jesus taught would be very close to the idea of allegory, to teach a truth, put it in a form like Richard's saying, to make it memorable, interesting, and really something that sticks with us.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, I know a lot of the reasons why I think this is such an important book, and we talked about literature and history, but Richard, for you as an educator, what are some of the great benefits or what are the blessings from the educational side that you see from somebody studying and reading this book?
I think that's a good question. As a teacher, as an educator, I think this book does provide you with a good understanding of what reading literature is all about. How do you read novels? How do you read fictions? And what are the literary devices that you can use when it comes to reading these kind of books? And as teacher, you can equip students in how they can read these kind of languages. So as an educator, I think you can basically help students in a systematic way to understand how these words, how these vocabularies, what do they mean, and how they are related to the Bible. So that can be a good way to, as an educator. Apart from that, also and as an educator, you can help students look through the meta-narrative, that my story is connected to this grand story of life. So that can be another important thing as an educator. As a student, I think also equally important that you can actually identify your life in terms of different situation, different phase, and where are you actually moving towards, and what is your purpose, what is the meaning of life. So reading these books can definitely help as students, even as an educator. What about as parents or as pastor or congregation? How does this book help them?
Yeah.
How does the book help them?
Yeah, I've been trying to encourage my children, my older children, to get into this book, because some of the things you mentioned as a parent are what I want for them as well. And as a pastor, I've used the Pilgrim's Progress actually in some Bible studies to kind of guide our Bible study, especially for new Christians, because it is a journey of faith. And as a pastor, also for myself in my preaching and teaching, it enriches me. Probably some of you may have heard famous preacher Spurgeon had said that with John Bunyan, if you were to prick him or poke him, he would bleed out the Bible, because his writing is so biblical. So it helps me as a pastor. And then also for the people in the congregation and for our churches, you have different people at different stages in life. Some may be young, some may be old, some may be Christians for a long time, some may not be yet believers in Jesus Christ. And the book actually covers so many of those different age groups and stages of life that it can really be kind of a companion that goes along with somebody, whether they're in the early stages of struggling with sin or the later stages where they realize their next big event in life is actually to die and go to heaven. Bunyan covers all those things, so it's really a priceless treasure alongside the Bible to use in a church and a congregation, and I know many churches and pastors have done that.
Okay. Finally, we're going to look at what's the content of this book all about. What is this allegorical literature is all about? What is the story? What is it? What is the significance for us, or why is that so important for us to learn this, or to read this, or to even understand it? I think one of the things that this book chronicles is about the real life conversion and the journey of John Bunyan himself, because all the imagery and all the process in his journey is definitely related to his own life. So in some way, he's trying to narrate what a Christian life is all about, what it means to be a disciple of Christ. So that's one, I would say, why John Bunyan picked up this whole adventure of writing this book. The other thing, I'm also reminded that it's also a celebration of his faith, that he is moving from his burdens being laid down at the Calvary, and now he is moving all the way to the celestial city. So I see that he is narrating this whole pattern, this sequence of what a Christian life is all about. Anything else you want to add to that?
That's great. And I think that describes kind of the fun in reading the book, because it's so intensely personal. It's about him, and you can see Bunyan in the writing, his thoughts, his emotions, the things he encouraged himself with or got discouraged, very personal. But as you read it, especially if you're a Christian, if you're a believer, you're also going to see yourself in it, because since it is universal and since it's classic, as you read along with it, you're going to see a similar experience you've had in your life. And then also there may be some parts of the book to where you're wondering the same questions he was wondering about, and it gives you a bit of guidance. So it's very personal, but it's very relatable. And then as well, it's a great adventure, because it's covering all the way from his spiritual birth to the final days as he enters into heaven. So it's a great adventure to go along with in this novel.
Yeah. So finally, we want to just close this introductory session with this, with this whole idea that we're going to move through the 10 or 11 sessions, picking up different elements from the book, and we will provide you a brief summary as well as try to explain some of the imageries for you. At the same time, we want to actually help us understand, as Dr. Jonathan just said, we want to be relatable. This is what you call a 17th century book. How is it relevant for my life or to your life? And that's what we want to make it connecting to our lives, and what do we do in this world. So that's what we're going to do in the rest of the session. So keep tuned, and I want you to come back next week for session 1. So Dr. Jonathan, any closing words?
Sounds great. I'm excited to go on this journey with John Bunyan, to go on it with Richard, and also with you as well. So I hope you join us and dig into this great classic. And if you read it and you really see it in your life, it can change your life as well.
Thank you. So we'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.